Hello, this is Malachi Bishop with the Rehabilitation Counseling Program at the University of Kentucky, and this is Ethics in Rehabilitation Counseling. We are continuing our review of the Code of Ethics with some critical points and key changes of which you should be aware. We have covered sections C through I, and we are picking it up now with the significantly enhanced and revised section on technology. Section J deals with technology issues and distance counseling. And what we want to talk about here is the fact that things have changed quite a bit in the last 20 years as a result of technology and the integration of technology in counseling and rehabilitation counseling. And the advent of new technologies and electronic devices has opened up a new world of possibilities for counseling. But with this new world of possibilities comes a wide variety of new ethical concerns and questions. Technological changes and developments and the subsequent changes from the integration of these developments and the methods by which we provide counseling services do have significant ethical implications, and we are going to talk about a number of technological changes, but I want to talk about this key main idea of computer-mediated counseling. And computer-mediated counseling refers to any type of counseling that uses a computer, and that includes things like internet, email, chat rooms, online support groups, video conferencing, and so on. When we say counseling that involves the use of a computer, we're really talking about obviously a wide range of potential there. And Christopher Goodrich, who is a doctoral candidate when the article was written in counselor education at Syracuse University, studied the topic of computer-mediated counseling, and he was quoted in an article by Kennedy in Counseling Today 2008, and I'll provide that reference in just a minute. He was quoted in relation to identifying the pros and cons of computer-mediated counseling. And on the pro side, computer-mediated counseling does provide access to clients in areas where prior they may not have had access to rehabilitation counseling. I guess it's a pro and con is that there is flexibility in time. Counseling is done at the client's leisure without having to travel to a counselor's office. Services are provided in at least one study. The use of computer-mediated counseling has been proved to be effective with cognitive behavioral therapy for depression and anxiety. I think as we move on into the future with computer-mediated counseling, there will be more research into the effectiveness of using computers to deliver various sorts of therapy. And the pros list in that regard will grow. But there are several cons and issues to be aware of as well, including limited research proving the effectiveness of computer-mediated counseling. Not a lot of research yet. Questions about the establishment of the therapeutic alliance when you're working in a relationship mediated by computers, and we'll talk more about that. The costs of technology and equipment for providers and consumers of counseling and rehabilitation counseling, and issues of accessibility by persons with disabilities, by clients, to accessing computer-mediated counseling. Ethical considerations in this area. There are precautions that must be taken prior to engaging in computer-mediated counseling. And this information, again, was from that article by Kennedy, 2008 Counseling Today, and I provided the reference there. But Kennedy talked about precautions that we need to think about before we enter into a computer-mediated counseling relationship. These include making sure that conversations and exchange of information can be encrypted to ensure confidentiality. We need to perform risk assessments. And what we're talking about here is making sure that you as a counselor know that the contact information and locations of clients, so that if there is a situation where the client needs to be referred to a resource for things like suicidal ideation or other emergency medical or mental health situations, that you are able to provide the resources that you need to. Being aware of a client's access and basic computer knowledge. We can't make assumptions about this. We need to have some conversation about this with our clients, where they're using computers, how they're using computers, and how effectively they are able to use computers. We need to be familiar with the ethical codes for distance counseling, and many organizations that we would be involved with, including the American Counseling Association, the American Psychological Association, the MBCC, and the CRCC, all have adopted provisions into their codes of ethics for the use of technology in counseling or providing services. Being cognizant and aware of legal issues associated with providing computer-mediated counseling, we'll talk about some of those, and making sure that we have the proper licensure and credentials for distance counseling. Barros, Bailey, and Saunders have an article in the 2010 Rehabilitation Counseling Bulletin special issue on the revised code of ethics, and this information comes from their article, but I want to point out, if I haven't earlier, that there is a 2010 Rehabilitation Counseling Bulletin and special issue on the new code, and there are a number of articles addressing different elements of the revision, and I highly recommend that you review that special issue. But in this article, they're talking about the work of the task force on revising the code with respect to technology, and suggested that technology ethics in rehabilitation counseling was integrated in the code, the prior version of the code, but there has been little attention in the professional rehabilitation counseling literature since then. So a work group was put together, and we've talked about this development of the code through work groups of the task force, and the group that was working on technology and the code of ethics found that the provisions of the 2002 code generally offered adequate guidance, but there were some issues that needed to be addressed. So the code, prior version of the code, did a good job and was consistent with with other professional codes, but there were a few issues that needed to be addressed. For example, there was a growing awareness that counselor behaviors are different when they're communicating via computers as opposed to face-to-face. And one issue here is inhibition, and this is an idea that we can probably all relate to. This idea that when we are communicating electronically, we communicate differently because there is less inhibition and a different set of filters involved than when we communicate face-to-face. So that's one thing that the code addresses. Another related issue is that counselors often do not perceive even traditional counseling behavior as counseling when they're providing it through computer technology. So the things that we do and we consider to be counseling when we're working face-to-face doesn't feel or seem like counseling when we are doing it mediated by a computer. In order to increase awareness that behavior with the use of technology is different. Counselor behavior is different when we are behaving with technology, and that this could be detrimental to the counseling relationship. The first standards in this section, J1A through J1C, clarify those issues. Clarify that those using technology in their role are held to the same standards as when we are doing face-to-face counseling. So let's look at these standards. First one, behavior and identification, talks about application and competence, and says that explicitly that we are held to the same level of expected behavior and competence regardless of whether we are face-to-face or using technology. Rehabilitation counselors will be aware of behavioral differences with the use of the internet and other methods of electric communication, and how these may impact the counseling process. And finally, that we will educate clients on how to prevent and address potential misunderstandings that arise when we are communicating electronically from the lack of visual cues and voice intonations. So we will be aware of differences in behavior. We will make our clients aware, and we will talk with our clients about potential misunderstandings. Another issue that needed to be addressed in the revised code was confidentiality. And the issue here, as Barrows, Bailey, and Saunders point out in their article, is that basically when we are communicating in ways that can be easily captured, copied, transferred, disseminated, and stored through electronic technology, then the danger for a breach of confidentiality increases. And as a result, we need to identify these dangers and discuss them with our clients. So this section of the these standards deal with this issue of confidentiality, disclosure, and informed consent. And basically, it reiterates the importance of confidentiality and informed consent when we are providing counseling services through technology, that we will address and explain these limits in technology used in the counseling process in general, ensuring and maintaining confidentiality of information that is transmitted electronically. A colleague, supervisor, and an employee such as information technology administrator or paraprofessional staff who might have authorized or unauthorized access to electronic transmissions. An authorized or unauthorized user, including a family member and fellow employee who has access to technology that the client may use. Pertinent legal rights and limitations that govern the practice of a profession over jurisdictional boundaries. So we'll be discussing the legal issues involved. Record maintenance and retention, technology failure, unavailability or crisis contact procedures, and protecting the client information during the counseling process and after we have finished the counseling process and terminated the counseling relationship. So it is, as in the beginning of any counseling relationship, it is a statement about the things that need to be covered, and you can see there are several issues that we need to address. J3B deals with transmitting confidential information and basically says that we will be careful and take precautions to make sure that information transmitted electronically is confidential. And J3C deals with security. We will use encrypted or password-protected internet sites or email communications to help us make sure that the information is confidential when possible, and take reasonable precautions to ensure the confidentiality of information transmitted through the use of computers, emails, fax, telephones, voicemail, answering machines, and other technology. We will notify clients of the inability to use encryption if we do not have the ability, or password protection, and the hazards of not using these measures, and we will limit transmissions to general communications that are not specific to clients and or use nondescript identifiers. So we will, again, we'll protect the confidentiality. We will be aware of security options that provide security when they are available, and when they are not, we will make the client aware of that, and we will limit our communications accordingly. And then the J3D reminds us of the need to be aware of how easy ethical breaches can be when we are working in electronic media. And the code points out that in situations where it is difficult to verify the identity of rehabilitation counselors, clients, and guardians, and or team members, we will address imposter concerns by using code words, numbers, graphics, and other nondescript identifiers, and we will establish a method for verifying identities. J7 deals with legal issues that may be involved in telecounseling, including issues of working across state lines, and the importance of, because we may be working across state lines, that legal issues will vary. And remember that we need to be aware of the legal requirements and guidelines and other guidelines that might vary across state lines, and we need to remember that in some practice settings the HIPAA, or Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, may come into play. We will review pertinent legal and ethical codes for possible violations emanating from the practice of distance counseling. So that is the section that deals with being aware of legal and ethical codes. And then Standard B talks about ensuring the use of technology does not violate the laws of any local, regional, national, or international entity when we are engaged in distance counseling, and we will observe the relevant statutes and seek assistance when using technology in such a manner. So we will be informed, and we will be aware that when we are doing distance counseling, legal and professional and a variety of statutes come into play. Skipping ahead to Standard J10, this section talks about the importance of addressing unavailability related to technology. So it could be dealing with technological failure and making clients aware that this may happen, and providing an alternative means of communication if it does. Providing clients with instructions for contacting us when we are unavailable through technological means, and providing referral information for at least one agency or rehab counselor on call for crisis intervention in their geographical region. So dealing with that issue of risk management when we are working with people who are not in our area. J11 talks about distance counseling credential disclosure and says that when we are practicing through internet sites, we provide information to clients about applicable certification boards, licensure bodies, in order to facilitate client rights and protection and to address ethical concerns. So we talk about issues like the fact that licensure varies across state lines. According to the Barrows, Bailey, and Saunders article, there are several methods that can be employed to adhere to this standard, including things like professional disclosure statements at the beginning of our counseling relationship, but also including language to this effect when we communicate by electronic documents and the variety of ways that we do that. Three standards in this section are concerned with the distance counseling relationship. The first one, A, deals with benefits and limitations. It requires that rehabilitation counselors inform their clients of the benefits and limitations of using technology in the counseling process. Standard B talks about when technology-assisted distance counseling services are deemed inappropriate by the counselor or the client, then we will pursue either face-to-face or other means of working with our clients. And then third, boundaries addresses establishing boundaries with clients, family members, and service providers. So we will attend to this issue of boundaries in technological and distance counseling, and the appropriate use and or application of technology and the limits of its use within the counseling relationship. And with things like internet and chat rooms and social networking, there are all sorts of potentials for ethical complications in the area of boundaries and relationships and communication in this distance counseling in these distance counseling relationships. J13 talks about security and business practices, and I just wanted to highlight one that I think is interesting. Dealing with internet sites, you should be aware that you're ethically required to practice when you're practicing through internet sites to obtain the written consent of legal guardians or other authorized legal representatives before you render services, in the event that clients are minor children or adults who are legally incompetent or incapable of giving informed consent, and two, that we strive to provide translation and interpretation capabilities for clients when they have a different primary language, while also addressing the imperfect nature of such translations or interpretations. So we will provide translation and interpretation capabilities, and we will work to overcome the limitations that exist in that area. Wanted to say a quick word about email, not directly addressed in the code. It is addressed, but I want to make it more explicit. Some things that you should talk to your clients about when you're communicating with them by email. Clients who use email in the workplace for consultation cannot be assured of confidentiality. So when you're working with clients, you want to make them aware that if you are communicating at work, then the communication is not necessarily confidential. You may be exposing your personal details to your employers, coworkers, and so on. Consumers should also be aware that if they use email at home, other members of the family or other members of the household may have access to their information. You should find out and be aware if your agency does use encryption technology and what type of information will be shared via email is something that you need to talk to your client about. What is appropriate, what is not, in terms of confidentiality, where is appropriate and where is not, and basically you need to talk about all of this prior to engaging in email communication with your clients. Section K deals with business practices, and I encourage you to review Section K in detail. We are just going to look at a couple of issues in Section K. Section K points out the importance of keeping documentation, records, and so on, establish and maintain documentation consistent with your agency policy, and this documentation should be accurate and sufficiently reflect the services provided. Identify the provider of the services, and if in the future case notes needed to be altered, this would be done in a manner that preserves the original notes and is accompanied by the date of change, information that identifies who made the change, and the reason for the change. That's an important thing to be aware of in terms of keeping records. And in section K3, which identifies issues with fees, setting fees, bartering, and billing, I wanted to point out, and this has been maintained from the previous code, that bartering is discouraged. Let's look exactly at what this one says. We will ordinarily refrain from accepting goods or services from clients in return for rehabilitation counseling services. And the reason is that such arrangements create inherent potential for conflicts, exploitation, and distortion of the professional relationship. So bartering for goods or services in providing rehabilitation counseling services is discouraged for a number of reasons. It creates the potential for a number of problems. However, rehabilitation counselors will participate in bartering only if, so it doesn't completely rule out the concept, but we will engage in bartering only if the relationship is not exploitative or harmful to clients and the client requests it, and there is a clear written contract established, and such arrangements are an accepted practice in the community or culture of the clients. So bartering is discouraged. It can be engaged in some very specifically arranged situations. More thing in section K that I think you want to be particularly aware of. It states that rehabilitation counselors in fee-for-service relationships may terminate services with clients due to non-payment of fees, and it sets the following conditions. First, clients need to be informed of their payment responsibilities and the effects of non-payment or the termination of payment by third parties, and clients do not pose an imminent danger to themselves or others. As appropriate, rehabilitation counselors will refer clients to other qualified professionals to address issues unresolved at the time of termination. So a couple of important issues to be aware of there concerning termination in section K. And then finally, we're going to talk about a couple of things in section L, which deals with resolving ethical issues. Different title from the last code. A couple of things I wanted to point out, I want you to be aware of, but I'm not going to go through the whole section, so I want you to do that. But there are a few statements that sort of spell things out right at the beginning, and I want to go over these. The first is that it is an ethical responsibility. It is a part of ethical practice that you read your code of ethics, that you seek clarification for any questions that you have, any standards that are not clear to you. All right? So it is ethical practice to read and understand your code of ethics. Not knowing or misunderstanding your code will not be a defense if you are charged with unethical conduct. So you can't say, I didn't read it, so I didn't know. Standard L2 deals with the application of the standards, and there are a few things here I wanted to be explicit about. First of all, we talked about decision-making models and skills. The code says that you must be prepared to recognize underlying ethical principles and conflicts among competing interests, and you must be able to apply appropriate decision-making models and skills to resolve ethical dilemmas and act ethically. So that is an ethical requirement. Addressing unethical behavior deals with when we observe or are aware of unethical behavior, and it says rehabilitation counselors expect colleagues to adhere to the code. When we possess knowledge that raises doubt about another rehabilitation counselor's adherence to the code, we take appropriate action. We have previously addressed this, but it is an important issue. I will highlight this idea of when there is a conflict between ethics and laws, and basically the code says that we will follow the law in our jurisdiction. If there's a conflict between ethics and the law, we will make known our commitment to the code and take steps to resolve this conflict. If the conflict cannot be resolved, we may adhere to the requirements of the law in our jurisdiction. And then D, it is an ethical requirement that we understand ethics codes from other professional organizations, certification or licensure bodies of which we are members. So if you are a CRC and you are a licensed professional counselor, or you belong to any of the many other organizations or professional bodies that may also have a code of ethics, you are ethically required to be familiar with the different codes of ethics that apply. And remember, though, that rehabilitation counselors are aware that the code forms the basis for CRCC disciplinary actions. If there's a discrepancy between the codes of your various affiliations, you are held to the CRCC standards. And then E, consultation. When you are uncertain whether particular situations or courses of action may be in violation of the code, you are ethically required to consult with other professionals who are knowledgeable, supervisors, colleagues, or other appropriate authorities, including, for example, the CRCC, your state licensure boards, or legal counsel. And I've tried to emphasize the importance of consultation throughout our discussions, and remember, I've suggested that you can review the advisory opinions of the CRCC. It's always a good idea to be in touch with legal counsel when you have questions about whether legal guidelines come into play. And also it's important to be aware of the fact that your licensure board will have resources for consultation. And then the last issue I wanted to touch on deals with organizational conflicts. Another area where problems, questions have been raised with the CRCC and in ethical complaints. And this one deals with organizational conflicts, and it says, if the demands of the organizations with which you as a rehabilitation counselor are affiliated are in conflict with the code, then you are to specify the nature of the conflict, express to your supervisors or other responsible officials your commitment to the code. When possible, we will work toward change within the organization. We'll try to work constructively within our organization to create full adherence to the code, and in doing so, in the process of working toward change, we will address any confidentiality issues. So that's section L. And that will conclude our overview of the remaining sections of the code, C through L.